Thank you all for attending today. We have a very exciting webinar coming up. I just have a few housekeeping things to talk about. First of all, a little plug for myself. Please, if you haven't already noticed our e-learning blog, it's managingelearning.com. And we've been writing this blog for almost 10 years now. So you'll see a lot of interesting content. And we just upgraded our search feature. So now you can mine the history of our blog posts. So I also want to comment on our sponsor. First of all, I want to thank Org Community. They've enabled us to provide a larger audience. I'm sure many of you that are interested in continuing medical education may have found out about this webinar from the Org Community mailings. They allow us to help find good speakers as well, like today's presenter. Org Community connects organizations, association executives, industry partners through online discussion forums. They have some great programs annually. I've been putting on some super face-to-face programs. And I encourage you to subscribe to .org Community for even more online and live educational programming. And note that this will help you fulfill your CAE requirement at one low cost. So I'm very excited today to also talk about the overall first quarter webinar series. We've got a great lineup. In February on the 27th at 11:30 Central, we'll have usability tips for a seamless learning management system and seamless e-learning from Sandstorm Design. We'll be hearing from Michael Hartman. Then in March, a very exciting webinar on raising the bar with virtual reality. Dan White has been an expert in developing serious games as well as using virtual reality at Filament Games. So that's a do not miss webinar on March 27th. So let's get started. I've known Tammy for several years and we do a lot of collaboration together. She's an outstanding consultant and has a great deal of experience in the medical educational space, and she's worked, I know, with such names, brand names as Mayo Clinic. I'm sure she'll talk about that a little bit. She's also a educational technologist in that she understands technology, and therefore a great combination of educational development, program development, but from somebody who knows online learning. So without further bragging about Tammy Bonnet, ADME, please, all of you, welcome her. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody, or good afternoon. Thank you for the kind introduction, John, and I look forward to sharing some tips and tricks from my history in building digital content and digital CME content in particular. Today, just as a warning, we're going to be concentrating more on practice. So not just the theory of building online content, but really the practice. What are the do's and don'ts, and what are the things that you need to be thinking about as you're building out your content and your content strategy. So without further ado, I'm going to get started. First, we're going to look at the CME landscape, and we're really just going to spend a couple of quick slides looking at CME today and how it's evolving and how that potentially plays into your digital content strategy. So for one, I looked at the list of people who are joining us today, and several of you are involved in associations and CPDs that are focusing on content on continuing medical education. Several are focused, just it seems like, on just building digital content in general. So my hope is that what we're going to talk about today, while it does have a CME twist to it, will also be applicable to all. I should also mention that should you have any questions along the way, please feel free to type them into the chat. And Britt, our moderator, will either ping me and interrupt me when she hears a pause in my voice and ask the question, or we'll get to them at the end of the webinar. And I look forward to this being interactive and having as many questions as possible, so please don't hesitate to type something in there. So first off, for those of you who are experts in CME, I think that one of the things that is unique about this market, first off, is how physicians learn. Physician learning we know happens best through experience, reflection, self-assessment and feedback, social learning, and communities of practice. And the reason I mention this is obviously these 5 ways of learning really need to be a critical part of your content strategy. So when you're thinking about how I'm going to build content, it's not a matter of just taking content that you might have, articles that you have, and putting them online and quote unquote calling that content, but really thinking about how do physicians best learn, or how do even allied health personnel best learn, and does it kind of hit any of these bullet points? And if so, then start building a content strategy around it. But it's critical to make sure that it hits one of these bullet points. What makes digital CME different than other online learning? As John said, I have a history in CME, but quite frankly, I have a longer history in online learning. And so when I came to the CME market several years ago, these were kind of the things that stood out to me as being different about CME versus the rest of online learning out there. For one is your audience. Putting it frankly, do not suffer fools lightly. They tend to be highly educated, they're very intelligent, they tend to be self-driven learners. So rather than learners that need to be motivated to engage and to learn, these are a very self-driven group of learners. And probably where your digital strategy comes in most importantly, they're time-starved, and they're becoming increasingly time-starved as time goes by, as their practices get busier, as reimbursement requirements change. They have very little time for anything. And particularly also early career physicians have different expectations, as many of you know, around what their work-life balance is going to look like, and hence how much time they're going to put forth on their career versus their family and other outside interests. Another interesting thing to me about this particular market, and perhaps to you, is that the prevalence of live meetings and conferences in this space, where the rest of the world seems to be moving more towards digital only, and where the attendance at conferences is going down. It is going down in the CME space, but it's not going down, I would say, as rapidly as it is in other spaces. And I think there's a number of reasons for this. The other thing that I think that was shocking to me, quite frankly, when I entered the CME space, was the tolerance for this audience to watch streaming or recorded workshops or streaming or recorded live meetings, where the rest of the digital learning space is moving towards no longer than 5 to 10 minute videos, small chunks of content, et cetera. There tends to still be a high tolerance of physicians, for example, particularly in mid-career and late stage, to be open to watching a full-on lecture by a thought leader in a particular space. That may be a 45 to 60-minute lecture. Please don't misinterpret me as saying that that's going to build a strong digital learning strategy, but there certainly is a tolerance for it in this particular space. Another area where I think digital CME or CME is different is that, number one, your physicians are often your content creators, or at least your SMEs, your subject matter experts, and those SMEs, some come with little or no teaching experience. This is both different and similar, quite frankly, to the rest of the e-learning world. If you go into the higher ed space, you'll also find, for example, that oftentimes the best researcher or the best expert in a particular field does not necessarily make the best teacher. And that is certainly true in the CME space as well. Another area that is different is that meeting planners are now often the ones responsible for education at associations, at CPDs, at continuous professional development schools, and so forth. So that's a big difference there. Whereas if you go into a higher ed institution, for example, that's focused on learning, your typical education team is going to have a mix of educational technologists, instructional designers, and so forth. Oftentimes in the medical education space, those who are responsible for education are most adept at planning meetings, which is where their history, or meetings or live courses, which is where their history comes from, which means that digital education is definitely a new space for them and a new space to conquer. Maybe that's why some of you are here today, in fact. A couple other areas of the space that I would say are quite different is the types of content formats that are used. So for example, obviously in CME is one of the few spaces where you're going to find the concept of the regularly scheduled series, the RSS, which is typically like a grand rounds or tumor boards type session. The idea of journal reviews and journal clubs is something quite particular to the CME space. The title, enduring materials, for example, and the rest of the online world is typically referred to just as asynchronous or online content, whereas it has a true meaning in the CME space, and the type of content used there tends to be particular to this space. And then, like I said earlier, the streaming of live meetings. There is a new concept in the CME space in the last couple of years with the ability to gain credit from learning from teaching. And that is something that I think is quite different than other areas. The accreditation requirements in the space are quite different. And another thing is that most CME out there, or at least that I have observed, typically does not necessarily provide a one-stop shop for learners. So meaning if you were to go into learn about a different topic, I want to learn about Lean or Six Sigma, I can typically find end-to-end courses on that particular topic, or project management online. However, physicians and also other allied health professionals often tend to hunt and peck throughout the internet to find 2 credits here on one topic and 2 credits there on one topic. There are only a few providers that I'm aware of that actually really provide an end-to-end solution of, for example, of all the credit that a physician might need to be recertified that year. For CME providers, associations do typically provide that. Next, I'm going to talk a little bit about how the CME world is changing. And again, I provide all of this just in context of, okay, now that we know this about CME, how are we going to build a strong digital content strategy around this? So one is, I'm sure none of this is surprising to any of you, but the budgets for medical professionals are changing. Also with the proliferation of associations out there, professionals need to decide which meetings, for example, if they're going to attend. Oftentimes they're given a budget to be able to attend 1 live meeting a year, which means that there's other associations they belong to that also have live meetings or other courses they might want to attend, and they have to figure out other ways of getting that content that they might want to have acquired at the live session. Busier practices and lives aren't allowing for time away like they might have once upon a time. This is a big change in that healthcare systems and hospitals are expanding to ancillary locations, which means that when you have a central location or central HQ for that healthcare system or hospital, providing and disseminating the same level of content, often which was face-to-face content in some places, back to the idea, for example, regularly scheduled series and tumor boards and grand rounds. Now you're having to disseminate that same level of excellence all across the country in many cases, and making sure that those people at those ancillary locations feel like they have the same access to quality education as those at the mothership. So that is definitely a change that we're seeing throughout the last couple of years. Early career physicians with different learning expectations. When you look at our mid and late career colleagues, oftentimes they went to college and med school and did their residencies and fellowships at a time when there wasn't necessarily a learning management system and a combination of online and blended courses when they were learning. They didn't grow up with an iPad or a device in their hands. I don't want to get into the whole digital native versus digital immigrant concept, but there are different expectations of early stage physicians when it comes to how they can acquire their education and how they learn than some of our mid-career and late career colleagues. And so when building content, I think it's really important to keep those 3 distinctions in mind of different target audiences and who you are catering to. There's also been changes, as we know, pretty drastic changes in how MOC and CME have been changed in the last year that are all going to affect your digital content strategy. For one, ABIM, for example, is moving towards these new knowledge check-ins as opposed to recertification. Several of the other boards have already made that change. So for example, MOCA Minute with anesthesiology. Those types of continuous assessment, essentially knowledge check-ins, versus a recertification large test every 10 years has great implication when it comes to building digital content and the need for learning on the part of physicians and the need for continuous learning rather than doing a cramming for a specific board.
Hey,
CME
Tammy.
Yes.
Hi, this is John. So, just for those of our attendees that may not be on top of some of our acronyms, I just wanted to encourage you to maybe describe them for us. I know that most of our audience knows maintenance of certification and continuing medical education, but just wanted to, interrupt you rudely. Sorry. Because I think some of the people may not know,
sure,
ABIM and things like that. So, and then that's great. So, sorry.
No,
Thank
very
you.
helpful. Thank you for pointing that out. So here, John already gave the acronyms here. But in general, these are two different types of accreditation that physicians need to earn every year, and the requirements around them. The bottom gist of this is that the requirements around them have drastically changed in the last couple of years. And because those requirements have changed, the way in which content can be designed has also changed, meaning that the typical quote unquote, if you could see me right now, I'm doing air quotes, old school way of doing CME was always that, CME meaning continuing medical education, is that every single piece of content had to be encased in a pre and a post test, where often that pre and post tests were identical, and one could then measure the lift or the knowledge acquisition from pre to post. The requirements for MOC and CME have changed quite a bit so that there's other ways of building content. And I encourage you, I'm assuming that WebCourseSource might make this PowerPoint available afterwards, and I recommend you look at some of the links provided in here, because that has changed. One does not have to do the same old pre-post approach to things. One can do different things like self-reflection and group discussion and self-assessment on how your practice, how what you've learned is going to change your practice and so forth. So thinking about those kinds of things all are going to change your digital content strategy. So with that background, I'm going to move into kind of the 5 steps as I see them to building a strong digital content strategy. This might be a good point to take a quick question, if there are any, before I move on. Britt, are there any questions at this time?
There aren't any questions at this time.
Perfect. Then I will move on, and I will slow down. I talk very fast. I apologize. So when I look at what are the key steps when I'm planning a digital content strategy for the consulting clients that I work with, as well as the companies that I've been at, really all of them relate to these 5 areas. Number 1, what are your end goals? 2, what's your content strategy? 3, what are the people, who are the people that you have in order to build that, and hence how does your strategy need to relate to your skills and expertise? What are the tools that you're going to use to do that? And then what are the processes? And I particularly use this lovely smart art, kind of not quite a Venn diagram, but diagram to show that all of these things are also very closely entwined and they all relate to one another. So getting started, starting with the end in mind. It seems perhaps odd to think about the end before you think about getting started, but I would argue that you need to first figure out what your goals and end strategy is with your content before you actually start building anything at all. So a couple of things to think about here that are critical are, number 1, what kind of packaging are you going to be developing for this content? So for example, is your goal to create 2 hours of content or 1 hour of content, and then to create, and is your goal to have a series of potentially unrelated pieces of content that you're going to be offering? Or are you building a holistic and a comprehensive course? Because when doing so, obviously there's going to be huge implications for what your development strategy is going to look like when doing that. The other potential in-between option between maybe a course and small activities is learning paths. Are you going to create a specific learning path with multiple unrelated but related pieces of content as part of it? Another area to look at is accreditation. Before you get started at all, you're going to want to think about whether you plan on getting this content accredited, and if so, what kind of credit you need to get off you plan on offering, and what are the requirements of that credit that you plan on offering. The other important thing to think about is when should you get it approved. I will give an example. John mentioned, for example, that I did a significant amount of work with the Mayo Clinic, and I was working with a startup that built content together with the Mayo Clinic, and the idea of when should we get it approved was something that we had to think about at least a year in advance. And the reason behind that is because when we were taking live board courses and turning those into enduring materials, if we didn't get that approved truly beforehand and then the finalization of it done within the days following the course, then we were going to miss the window of being able to offer that. Since the course was typically offered 2 months prior to the actual exam, we were going to miss the window of being able to offer that and meet all of those crammers who are studying for the last 2 months before that exam, and potentially our biggest revenue opportunity and our biggest capturing of the market. So thinking about what your accreditation requirements ahead of time and then making sure that your timeline for your project plan takes all of that into account is absolutely key to the design of your content. Probably even more important is thinking about what kind of investment you're willing to look at for the content. There's a misnomer oftentimes that building digital content is inexpensive. But at the same time, which it is not, but at the same time, sometimes not building digital content, and meaning the hidden cost or the potential losses you have by not being able to offer something, is also expensive. So looking at what are your actual costs, how much are your people going to cost you, how much are the systems and the technology that you're going to be using to deliver this going to cost you, what are the actual subject matter expertise or delivery, marketing, help desk. You want to think about all of those pieces that are going to go into what your digital content strategy is going to cost you along the way. And at the same time, you also want to look at your hidden costs. So areas of the organization, for example, that may be supporting the rollout of your content, but aren't necessarily directly attributed to the content itself. And I would encourage you to look at also the opportunity loss costs as well. So not just what it's going to cost to develop, but if your meeting numbers, for example, for your live meeting are going down year over year, and you've done a survey that says they may be open to online content, what is the potential cost of losing that potential business as well, and having them potentially go to someone else who's offering it and losing them as a customer or member forever. Another thing to think about when you're thinking about the end first is what's your desired return on investment, your ROI. The critical piece, I think, to think about here, particularly if you're an association or CPD, is not just thinking about the actual ROI in terms of numbers, in terms of cost, and not just thinking about this, but also promoting internally when you're asking for that investment, but thinking about the ROI in terms of other critical pieces, such as building value into your membership, the market need, the educational need, organizational recognition. You know, is building a digital content strategy going to bring your organization more to the fore? And so those are things to think about in addition to ROI, but one should also think about the actual cost and how long it's going to take you in order to potentially be, if if money is the issue, then how long is it going to take you to be revenue neutral and revenue positive? And when thinking about those things, one has to take into account, like I said earlier, every aspect. So how much is the technology for the content delivery, technology for the content creation, all of the resources for the content delivery and content creation resources, meaning people, hidden costs, items like marketing, collection of funds, etc. All of those, the e-commerce piece, all of that needs to be taken into account when you're looking at your budget, what are going to be your initial costs, and then what are also going to be your ongoing costs in terms of maintaining that program and maintaining that content, as well as potentially refreshing it going forward. Another thing to think about is your business model. How are you best going to reach your members and or your potential customers through providing online content? So are you going to look at a subscription model to all of the content, for example, that you create, versus an a la carte, pay by credit, pay by activity? How is your market going to respond to that? Because if you don't think about these things first, then you're not going to develop the right content to necessarily fit that. In other words, if it's pay by activity and not by pay by course or so forth, then one wants to build value into those activities. If it's pay by subscription, then one probably wants to build some sort of breadth of the number of activities you have to make a subscription model make sense. Are you making this free to your members? Because going back to the ROI piece, the reason that you're doing this perhaps is to build more value into your membership, or is this an add-on to their annual dues? Again, all of these things are going to influence your content strategy, what you're building, why you're building it, the timeline for building it. What is your goal for reaching out to, if you're an association, non-members, for example? How are you going to price it for non-members? How are you going to market it to non-members? Is it a goal to reach non-members? And another thing to think about is partnerships. Are there other groups out there that are doing something similar to you that you could potentially partner with? Is there some way to jumpstart your strategy in some way that is beneficial to both you and a potential partner? So again, thinking about the end in mind is probably the first thing you need to do when you're getting started. A few questions to consider when you're thinking about this is, what are your goals? What competition already exists? And then I would argue that the biggest question of all, perhaps, when deciding on building a digital content strategy or growing a digital content strategy is, if you build it, how will they come? It is very rare that if you just build it and expect them to come, they're going to come. Going back to Kevin Costner and Field of Dreams. Instead, one needs to think about, if we build this, how are we going to get the word out there? How are we going to, like I said earlier, how are we going to price it? How are we going to market it? What is the way that we're going to ensure that that ROI, whether that ROI has dollar figures in it or a combination of dollar figures and value and recognition, is achieved? And then, do we plan to offer credit? Moving on, step 2, define your content strategy. So here, now that we've decided what is our end goals and how we're planning on what our business model is going to look like, then we can start looking at, okay, what kind of content formats are we going to be building, or combination of content formats? So we can look at the different types of activity formats that are available out there and determine what best fits our learners and what's best our target learners, and what best fits potentially the content that we are best known for or do best. So on-demand modules, are we going to build complex on-demand asynchronous modules, or are we going to build short podcasts, or are we going to invite in a panel of our thought leaders and record that panel? Are we going to take live sessions that happened at a meeting and record those, and what's our strategy around those? I would encourage you, when you're looking at defining your content strategy, that you look at length, for example. As I mentioned earlier, CME, the CME space, or the continuing medical education space, seems to be the only space that I'm aware of where there still seems to be a tolerance for watching a 45 to 60-minute video. I have to assume that over time that's going to go away. And so, for example, if we're looking at our live meeting and potentially recording our live meeting and sessions at live meetings, are we going to record as is, or are we going to chunk that into smaller pieces. And if we're going to chunk it into smaller pieces, then there's huge implications for that way before the live meeting even happens, in terms of how we ask our speakers to set up their PowerPoints by topic, how we think about recording it, how we handle things like ARS. And so the ARS being audience response system, so live questions or polling that's happening at the meeting. So there's implications when deciding our content format that really need to be thought about well in advance before we start building anything at all. The next is our delivery modes. So are we looking at building content that is online only versus blended, and what are the implications around that? Is our content can be delivered synchronously, meaning users can take it at their leisure at any time, or I'm sorry, asynchronously, meaning users can take it at their leisure or at any time, or synchronously? Is it going to be a webinar series, for example, where they're going to log in once a week for a specific topic or once a month? And if so, what is our strategy around that? Are we recording the webinars, and how are we making those available to end users afterwards? And how are we making it known that we're making those available? Are we selling access just to the synchronous, or are we selling access to the live recorded pieces as well? All critical things to think about when planning your strategy. And then the last thing I would recommend when looking at for delivery modes is, what is your mobile strategy? Making sure that you have a mobile strategy in place. Going back to the very first slides where we talked about our target audience in continuing medical education, who tend to be time-starved and busier than ever, having a mobile strategy and thinking about it is key. Are they able to participate in the content, listen to the content when they're commuting, when they're on the go, when they're walking down the hallway from meeting to meeting or appointment to appointment? And what kind of devices will support that? Without defining that from the onset, there's no guarantees that the content that you build, both from a format perspective, from the tools that you use perspective, is going to work well without some foresight as it relates to that. Another critical piece to think about during step 2 of defining your content strategy is your maintenance and content refresh plan. Oftentimes when organizations look to build out their initial content strategy, they're not thinking about the long term. What is it going to take for me to maintain this content? What kind of people, budget, et cetera, am I going to need in order to maintain it? What is the lifespan of this content? So for example, if it's content that is about new guidelines that just got released, obviously in the very beginning, that potentially could be very hot content. How hot is it going to be 3 years from now, or when new guidelines come out that contradict the previous ones? So thinking about that, thinking about what your how often you're going to be releasing new content. So meaning, let's say going back to step 1, and we've decided our business model is going to be that of a subscription service. If it's a subscription service and I'm purchasing access to an entire library of content, then I'm going to have an assumption that there's going to be some refreshing that happens of that content and new content added from year to year. Make sure that your budget and your plan are accounting for that. It's a pretty easy mistake to make, which is thinking about just what I need to do to get out of the gate.
Hey,
Again,
Tammy,
yes?
I have a question for you.
Mm-hmm.
So Andy's wondering, I was just talking to a medical society who led education volunteer and pushing them to offer 7-minute micro live learning at their annual meeting. How should that work in terms of the mechanics of a live meeting, convening speakers and participants in the same place at the same time? Should there be series of short presentations in one place for an hour, presenters repeating their short presentations while attendees rotate through a space? Question mark.
Wow, there's a lot in there. How it should work as a live meeting is a good question. It depends. If you're going to be recording these, I would think that rotating attendees through, and if you're giving the attendees options to attend it later, making sure that they necessarily get to every single one of the 7 is not necessarily key, because they will have access to it from a digital aspect afterwards. What I've seen done at some good conferences is doing kind of mini sessions in between some of the bigger sessions for these little 7-minute sessions or little 5-minute sessions. So they, it could be during break times or during other times that they're worked into the schedule. What I would, again, going back to the idea of hopefully talking about theory, practice rather than theory, what I would be thinking about are some of the mechanics of how you're recording these sessions at the live conference. And I think I talk about this somewhere in here, but an example is if during these there's ARS, if there's automated audience response system questions, are you filming those? Are you filming the answers? Do you really want people in your live session to watch other people, in your digitized version of your live session to watch other people answering questions? Is that effective learning? Let's say the conference is happening in Hawaii. Do you want the video showing everybody wearing Hawaiian shirts? And do you want to film the dais, the podium for the speaker, which has a date on it, which automatically is going to potentially date this content once you put it online? There's a lot of small details about recording live sessions that I would highly recommend one think about before doing so. I would argue even that if you're going for these 7-minute sessions, I would ask those SMEs to record them separately for the digitized version of this than what is delivered at the live conference. The way people talk into a mic when they're dealing with when they know there's no audience versus how they address and the ums and the likes when there is an audience, and the acknowledging the audience in the room can often be off-putting for the online learner. So thinking about those kinds of things as well. I hope that answers somewhat of the question. I'm happy to go into it more towards the end as well. Is that okay?
Sounds great.
Okay. Another thing to look at finally when you're looking at defining your content strategy is also your desired learning outcomes. I find that a lot of CME, while it's supposed to be built from the objective up, tends to be built from the content down. And meaning we have this content in-house, we wrote this great paper on this, we have this great panelist who spoke about this, and now we're going to backwards engineer the objectives and or the competencies upon which it's based into the content. When done right, you would obviously want to start from your objectives and think about what are the competencies, what are the key areas that this needs to address. When building a live program and or building a course or learning path for online, another big thing to think about is avoiding redundancies and gaps. So meaning making sure that speaker X is not saying the exact same thing as speaker Y, which is pretty common in CME because oftentimes your faculty will come to lecture with their disk drive, their jump drive, with the same lecture that they typically give elsewhere in a new template. If you instead send them, here are the discrete objectives that we are expecting you to cover at this session, and here are the competencies it links back to, then you are more likely to reduce the number of redundancies that happen across various lectures to create a more cohesive program. You're also more likely to have to not have gaps within the content, meaning you expected faculty member A to discuss something and he didn't, and hence it's missing from your overall program. So starting with your objectives, starting with the competencies they link back to, clearly communicating that to your subject matter experts and making sure that they each understand the full-on program also of what's being offered, so that they can trust that, no, I don't need to mention this here because I know that my colleague is going to be mentioning it in his speech or her speech, and her didactic is a really strong way of building your live meeting, your live program, as well as building an online course. A few questions to consider. Again, these are just a few, and there's endless number questions to consider when it comes to building your content strategy. But one, is there a staged approach you can take in building your content? What are the low-hanging fruit you can start with? So should I start with my live meeting and the most attended sessions there? As I mentioned when answering Andy's question, what are the implications to taking a live meeting and recording it and putting it online? What are the implications to the learner? Another is how to encourage engagement and reflection, and how am I using that to best also meet accreditation needs? Where are my learners learners most likely to use this content? If they're going to be using it, for example, on their commute or when they're out on a run, then should I, for every video, also have potentially a podcast version of that, an audio-only version of that? Thinking about all of these things are critical to building out your content strategy. Moving on, know your people. Oftentimes it's great to think about building a digital content strategy, but one needs to also recognize the expertise that one has in-house, as well as the availability of that expertise and the prioritization of this project versus other pieces that you have in-house to do. I tend to not believe that when a plate is full, a lot can be added to that plate without suddenly the food spilling over. So number one, who's going to develop it? I would highly recommend that you have a project manager, someone experienced in project management, who is looking holistically across your organization and making sure that all of those pieces are in place for developing the content strategy. So again, not just thinking about developing the content itself, but how are we going to market it? How are we going to accredit it? How are we going to deliver it? How are we going to support learners once they're in the system? And building a full project plan around that. Do you have adult learning expertise internally? And if not, what do you need to know about that and how can you gain that expertise? Subject matter expertise. Think strongly about this. You may have the subject matter expertise, but what is their availability? And what is the carrot and the stick in order to get them to help you out and develop for you? Are you paying them? Are you giving them honoraria? Are you not paying them? And if so, what are the repercussions as it relates to your project plan? Technical design expertise. So if you're building on-demand modules, for example, or you're filming a panel, do you have an AV team in place? And if so, have you defined for them the specifications of what you're looking for there? And item writing if you're including questions in your content. Who's going to deploy it? Do you have the technical marketing and sales expertise in order to do that? And then again, also, who is your target audience? This kind of goes back to step one of keeping the end in mind, but making sure you know who your target audience is going to play very deeply into what kind of content strategy you build. An example being are you going to sell this B2B, business to business, this content, or offer this content B2B, or is it business to consumer? Are you offering it directly to the consumer? How you build the content, what kind of content you build, may vary drastically based on who is going to be the consumer, or at least the purchasing consumer potentially, or the person who selects to adopt this content. So something important to think about. Here, I would highly recommend that before embarking on any digital content strategy, whether it be building content for the first time for your organization, or whether it be expanding the types of content offerings that you already have, that you do a skills gap analysis internally. And whether you bring in a consultant to do that or you do it on your own, think long and hard about what are the skills we do have, what are the things that we don't have. With the skills that we do have, are there trade-offs for using those people on this particular strategy versus other things that they might already be doing? And are we willing to make those trade-offs? When to hire, thinking about when to hire and when to contract out. What are the types of, I would think very carefully about, in particular, what are the skills that we need in order to get started versus what are the skills we need for the long term, or what are the skills that we think that we can train our internal people on if we hire good contractors to help train them on. Externally, when you're building your content strategy, you want to think about your target customers, as I said, what's unique about them, how do they best consume content, what types of content are they more likely to consume versus others, why would they be coming to me, to our organization to get that content, and to monopolize on what it is you do best and to lead with what it is you do best as to why they would come to you. Next, select your tools. So as it relates to project management, make sure that you are working with strong, transparent project management tools across the organization. I gave a couple of examples here. I would say that the bottom 4 are the ones I would probably recommend the most, largely because they're largely cloud-based, which means that you can provide insight internally and externally to everybody who has a role in that project, and they can easily see at any given time where the project stands, as well as update the projects. So you want to make sure that you have strong project management, because a digital content development plan can quickly get derailed. What kind of tools are you using to develop the content itself? Are you building on-demand modules using Articulate and Lectora? Is this a webinar series? And if so, what is the best way to do that? Is it GoToWebinar, which we're on right now, Zoom webinar, WebEx? Always thinking about the end in mind. Are you planning on recording these? And if you're planning on recording them, where are you going to host them? So thinking about and what kind of limitations each of the different tools might have as it relates to that. So thinking about your tools there. Audio visual. So if you're recording live speakers, if you're recording didactics in a studio or so forth, thinking about what's your audio capture need to look like? What's your video capture need to look like? Where are you planning on offering this? What you needed to do to video capture for DVD once upon a time is different than potentially how you're going to be offering it online. Are you allowing learners to download content and the implications as it relates to that? Thinking about what kind of post-production work you might need as part of your audiovisual. So for example, if we are recording a live meeting or a plenary session, are we doing post-production on it? Meaning, are we chunking it down to size? Are we to smaller pieces? Are we removing elements in it that where audience was asking questions, or removing ARS? Thinking about all of those things in advance are critical to building your content strategy. And then finally, how are you delivering that content? Are you delivering it over an LMS, AMS, CMS? Many conference apps that exist out there are good for delivering extended live digital content. Webinar platforms. After you've recorded a webinar, are you hosting it in your LMS, AMS, CMS, or website? Or are you hosting it potentially on Vimeo or YouTube? And really collecting the tools that you're going to be using in order to do that. Here are some things that to think about in terms of building that tool strategy. So I would say number 1 is actually question number 2. What's the technological aptitude of my people and my customers, and selecting the tools that best fit that? Do I need delivery only on the web and mobile first? Looking at how this factors into your overall investment in building the content strategy. And then finally, now that you've decided on what kind of content you're going to be building, who's going to be building it, what are your business goals, what tools you're going to be using in order to build it, now it's time to build your process. So now one needs to think about building a prioritized, and I use that word as number 1 here, and plan, and also to consider it a phase plan. Do you need to create your end-all be-all first, or are there low-hanging fruit that you can consider when building out your content? And start small, test the waters, pilot, and then go from there. When you're building out a project plan for your online learning, I cannot recommend enough, with having 20 plus years, 22 years-ish of content development experience, the more detail, the better. Make sure that you cover every aspect of what it's going to take to build this content in your project plan, and never ever forget to add a buffer. And by a buffer, I typically include anywhere between 15 and 25% of time more than what I originally anticipated. The worst case scenario is that you sell this upstream and you end up beating your plan. But it's always good to beat your plan. It's never good to come in over. So always add a buffer up front to make sure that you're covering for that. When you're building content, consider creating delivery templates, creating a cohesive look and feel for all of the content that you're going to be offering. Doing so will reduce your development time when doing that. Plan for quality assurance, time, and resources. This is one of the bigger mistakes that I've seen many people make, is that they build a content plan, and they forget to leave time to test it out, to test out the content itself, and to go through and make sure that the content is solid, but then to also make sure that the content delivery mechanisms that you're using are solid, meaning the enrolling of learners in the content, the ability for them to take the content. If they're requesting credit through your system, the ability to request that credit and to then have that accreditation request approved and or viewed within the system. So making sure that you test end-to-end anything that your end users are going to be doing and leaving the time in your project plan to do that. Design and outcomes methodology from the onset. Always make sure that you're looking at how am I going to assess my content once I've got it out there, so that I can, for the long term, have continuous improvement. Build in time to iterate. Know that you're going to likely, as a result of that QA process, and also later on as a result of that outcomes methodology, that you're going to want to make changes to that content and build that into your long-term plan. Consider a pilot, like I mentioned, and then ensure time for accreditation. Make sure that if you need to submit, for example, internally to a different department to get accreditation approval, that you've left your time for that. Going back to my example earlier, if you're offering a course and it's just a couple of months, for example, before a board review, before an actual board test, you want to make sure you leave the time to get that accredit, because oftentimes that accreditation is the stamp of approval that's going to differ between somebody buying or using your content versus someone else's.
So Tammy?
Yes?
As you enter the questions to consider, I just have a quick question on working with subject matter experts. So how have you found that there's a difference between working with subject matter experts in the continuing medical education space as compared to others?
That's a good question. Yes, I have. First off, I should say it depends on what you're asking them to do. So if you're asking them to be a SME on a topic that they are a world-renowned expert and have lectured all over the world regarding that particular topic, then I find that working with subject matter experts is as easy in the CME world as it is anywhere else. Or as difficult, for that matter. If you are asking them to slightly step outside of their comfort zone, and by that I mean going back to my comment about designing from the beginning up. So you've given them specific objectives and competencies that you want them to learners to have after they've taken that SME's content, and hence you're really requiring them to think differently about the type of content that they're offered, that they're creating, then yes, I found that working with SMEs in the CME space can be a little bit more difficult, going back to kind of those original slides, in that they're highly time-starved and, doing this on the side. Working with SMEs also very much depends on, can I just say one quick thing? It very much depends on who you are when you're asking them to do this and what stage they are in their career. So, for example, for an association to ask its SMEs to do something, and if the SME either highly values their association and or is an early career physician, for example, who's looking to build up his or her resume, then oftentimes that's a big carrot to get them to develop. I've found that if you're a CME company and you're asking a SME to develop, even when you're offering them money to do that work, it's much more difficult than in other spaces, because these are already highly paid people, and typically what you can offer to have them build content is piddly compared to what they can make, and so it's not a huge driver.
Right. So you answered my next question, which is the efficacy of paying SMEs. But in terms of a business model and working with SMEs, so let's assume you are working with experts. What have you seen that works best? And usually they overvalue their content, and sometimes they want to maintain certain licenses to it. But have you seen any models that work to the benefit of the association or the CPD organization?
Well, one of the models that I've seen is catching them while they're in the moment. So what I mean by that is, for example, let's say you want to create some sort of enduring content out of content that they're delivering in a live meeting. There, I would say, set up a studio in a breakout room and have them redeliver it while they're there, because the minute they leave that live meeting, you've kind of lost them. you've lost their time. In terms of copyright, I think, which is what you were asking about, or the value of the content, that largely depends on where they work. You know, different universities, different medical schools, different groups have different different ownership over the content that their SMEs are delivering, or lack of ownership over the content that their faculty are delivering. So that's wholly dependent on where that person is from, typically, if they're faculty somewhere. But what have I seen work? It's catching them in the moment. It's strong communication with them. Unfortunately, like I said, I don't think that in this particular market, money is the huge carrot. Because we're not talking about an underpaid group of people. When you're talking about faculty in higher education and other spaces, oftentimes paying them extra to build content for you is a nice add-on to what they're doing, whereas in medical education, it doesn't always drive it. Does that answer your question, John?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you.
Okay. So we're reaching the end, but the slide's been on for a little while, so I'm sure everybody's had a chance to read it. But these are the types of things to consider when you're building your process. And the reason I have all of this on the process slide is that each one of these things needs to be built into that project plan that you're thinking about, and it needs to be adequate time needs to be built into your project plan for each of it. So for example, are you requiring activity evaluations? What's your outcomes methodology going to look like? So and leaving time for that in your project plan, and making sure that if you've got an annual cycle of continuous development, how long you're leaving to gather that outcomes data, generate outcomes reporting, and then feed that information back for continuous improvement for the coming year. So these are all aspects to think about when building out your project plan. And that is all I have to offer today in terms of building a digital content strategy. I hope this was helpful. Are there any questions?
Thank you, Tammy. We'll give everyone a few moments to ask any questions if they have any, and we'll move forward. All right, so I'm not seeing anything come through, but I would like to thank everyone for joining us today. And please take the short post-webinar survey. This will help us improve the quality of our webinars. We will also be sending a follow-up email to all registrants with a link to the webinar and other links that have been in this presentation. And I want to thank everyone again and have a great day.